8.22, maximal range of power. Is an adequate range account of omnipotence available to us? Some have despaired of ever finding such an account, but their frustration was occasioned by the demand that such an account be theologically adequate. It seemed that in order for God to count as omnipotent, he would, for example, have to be able to perform actions which only an evil being could do. Given God's essential goodness, he is unable to perform such actions, even though he has the power to do so. There could therefore be a being as equally powerful as God, but with a greater range of power, so that God does not count as omnipotent. Now, if this line of argument is sound, it follows only that the theologian should discard the term omnipotence with respect to God, not conclude that an explication of omnipotence cannot be given. 8.221, conditions of adequacy on a range account. Flint and Freddoso provide a useful list of 5 conditions of adequacy for any range account of omnipotence. Number 1, an analysis of omnipotence should be stated in terms of an agent's ability to actualize or bring about states of affairs. The alternative of analyzing omnipotence in terms of ability to perform tasks is widely recognized to generate unnecessary difficulties. For example, if we say that S is omnipotent just in case S can perform any logically possible task, then we rule out, say, Zeus's being omnipotent simply on the grounds that Zeus cannot perform the logically possible task of saying something which is being said only by Jones. Such an analysis seems unduly restrictive. By contrast, on a state of affairs account, the state of affairs of Zeus is saying something which is being said only by Jones is logically impossible, and thus unproblematically not within anybody's ability to actualize. 2, an omnipotent being should be expected to have the ability to actualize a state of affairs only if it is logically possible that someone actualize that state of affairs. Flint and Freddoso will argue that there are logically possible states of affairs that no one can actualize, and so S's inability to actualize them does not count against his omnipotence. Notice that 2 states only a necessary and not a sufficient condition of omnipotence. 3, any adequate account of omnipotence must be relativized to a possible world W and a time T. Thus, our analysandum should be S is omnipotent at T in W. Flint and Freddoso state that this condition rests on the metaphysical presuppositions that 1, states of affairs are tensed, and 2, time travel is logically impossible. And I make some comments on that, but I'm inclined to agree with both of those, and so I'm happy with these as conditions on an account of omnipotence. 4, an omnipotent being should have the ability to actualize a state of affairs S only if S obtains in some world in which the same world type for S is true. A world type for S is all the true counterfactuals of freedom concerning any person other than S. Any adequate analysis of omnipotence must take account of the logically inescapable limitations which true counterfactuals of freedom place on an omnipotent agent. Since it is logically impossible for any agent to escape this type of limitation, such a limitation cannot disqualify a being from counting as omnipotent. So in assessing S's omnipotence in W, one will restrict one's attention only to worlds sharing the same world type for S as W. That is to say, worlds in which the same counterfactuals of freedom are true for S. 5, no being should be considered omnipotent if it lacks the range of ability which it is clear an omnipotent agent ought to possess. In other words, one's analysis of omnipotence must not be too weak in its demands, as well as too strong. An omnipotent being must have the maximal range of power consistent with the first 4 conditions. Is there any comment about those 5 conditions that Flint and Freddoso laid down?
I was just going to ask about states of affairs.
Yes.
Is this where the states of affairs analysis that you give of omnipotence comes from? From
Yes.
Flint and Freddoso?
Yeah, Flint and Freddoso emphasize this. So you don't focus on tasks to be done, but on actualizing states of affairs. And that really does remove a lot of the traditional conundrums.
So that way you can be sovereign over free creatures.
Excuse me?
He's saying so that way you can be sovereign over futures?
Or free creatures.
Free creatures?
Because you can make a free creature do something. Sorry.
Well, think of the illustration that they give about Zeus. I think that's the one that's helpful. The task of saying something that is only said by Jones is logically possible because Jones can do that. But the state of affairs, of actualizing the state of affairs, Zeus is saying something which is being said only by Jones, is logically impossible. So we want to focus not upon tasks, but upon actualizing states of affairs. And those, as that example illustrates, can involve free creatures. Well, now I go into a number of failed accounts, which in the interest of time, I don't want to discuss in class. We'll just review them. D1 is that S is omnipotent, means S can bring about any state of affairs, and that would be Descartes' position that God can even bring about logically impossible states of affairs. D2 on the next page is Aquinas' formulation. S is omnipotent, means S can bring about any state of affairs that is metaphysically possible. And then there is a critique of that view as well. Third would be D3, a few pages later. S is omnipotent, means S can bring about any state of affairs which is metaphysically possible for S to bring about. And this gets into problems with Mr. Mapir. And then we come finally to 8.223, the Flint-Freddoso account. So let's pick up our lecture at that point. A more sophisticated account of the range of God's power is therefore needed. Although there are several proposals in the literature, we shall focus our attention upon one of the more promising, namely Flint and Freddoso's own account, which they claim successfully meets the 5 stated conditions of adequacy. Their own formulation of their analysis is quite complicated. You find it there in footnote 36. I was amused when some years after the article appeared, Tom Flint shared with me that he reread the article and found it difficult to understand. But I try to express it here more simply as follows. For any agent S, possible world W, time T, and state of affairs, lowercase s, S is omnipotent at t in W if and only if, and now here comes this big conditional. S has the power at t in W to actualize S if there is some world W star sharing with W the same history at t and the same world type for S in which someone actualizes S at t. I'll repeat that. S is omnipotent at t in W if and only if S has the power at t in W to actualize S if there is some world W star sharing with W both the same history at t and the same world type for S in which someone actualizes S at t. We can simplify further by focusing on what it is for S to be omnipotent in the actual world. And here that is. S is omnipotent at t if and only if S has the power at t to actualize S if there is some world having both the same history at t and the same world type for S as the actual world in which someone actualizes S at t. Flint and Freddoso's account relies upon a couple of crucial notions that merit explanation. First is the notion of two worlds sharing a history. In our discussion of divine omniscience, we saw that Freddoso's concept of a world's history, developed in his account of temporal necessity, is emphatically not the historian's concept of history. Rather, a world's history is a series of temporally ordered submoments, each comprised of the immediate propositions that are true at t in W. An immediate proposition P is an atomic, non-quantified, present tense proposition that is temporally indifferent. That is to say, it is such that either P is not logically contingent, or else P, like not P, can be true at a first, a last, or an intermediate moment of time. Two worlds share the same history at t, just in case they have identical submoments obtaining in the same order prior to t. It is a consequence of Freddoso's concept of a history that states of affairs, like Isaiah's prophesying the fall of Jerusalem and Daniel's dreaming that Babylon would be overthrown, are not part of our world's history. And that's because they are not immediate propositions, given that these are done under divine inspiration. They imply their future realization. The inclusion of the stipulation that W and W star share the same history at t is needed to meet condition 3 of adequacy. For many philosophers have held that the past is in some sense necessary and that there are therefore purely temporal restrictions upon the power of any agent. It may be too late for even an omnipotent agent to actualize some states of affairs. In order to accommodate the epistemic possibility that there are purely temporal restrictions on the power of an omnipotent agent, one's account of omnipotence must be indexed to a world and a time. Flint and Freddoso satisfy condition 3 by claiming that an omnipotent agent should be expected to have the power at t and W to actualize S only if there is a world W star such that 1, W star shares the same history with W at t, and 2, in W star, someone actualizes S.
So concerning the example of the Eiffel Tower being destroyed and then
Yes.
it being destroyed, this is basically an argumentation for that same concept.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
That some folks will say, given that the Eiffel Tower's been destroyed, that is now a hard fact about the past, and it's impossible to do anything about it. And so they want to accommodate that intuition by saying that these worlds need to have the same history up to T.
I thought I followed the argument, but I wanted to make sure.
Okay. Second is the notion of a world type for S, which plays a crucial role in Flint's account of divine middle knowledge. A world type for S comprises all the true counterfactuals of freedom over which S has no control, because they involve the libertarian free decisions of others. Following Alvin Plantinga, Flint and Freddoso distinguish between strong and weak actualization of a state of affairs. And I think this is relevant, Theo, to your concern. An agent S strongly actualizes a state of affairs S, just in case S causally determines that S obtains. That is, S does something which, in conjunction with other operative causal factors, constitutes a sufficient causal condition for S's obtaining. Since it is logically impossible to causally determine another person's free decision, an omnipotent agent cannot be expected to have the power to strongly actualize libertarian free decisions. In the case of weak actualization, an agent can bring about the free decisions of others by strongly or weakly bringing it about that another agent, S prime, is in a situation, C, where it is true that if S prime were in C, then S prime would freely act in a specified way. In other words, by exploiting his knowledge of true counterfactuals of freedom, an omnipotent agent would have the power to actualize states of affairs involving the libertarian decisions of others. So Flint and Freddoso take the term actualize in their analysis to include both strong and weak actualization. Quote, this underscores nicely the impressive nature of maximal power, extending as it does even to the free actions of others. Given the world type for S, however, S will not be able to weakly actualize states of affairs involving the free decisions of others unless such states are described in consequence of true counterfactuals of freedom. It is not possible that the counterfactuals of freedom requisite for weak actualization of certain states of affairs are false, that is to say, not part of S's world type, and that S actualizes such a state of affairs, weakly or strongly. Since this is a purely logical restriction on S's ability to actualize states of affairs, such inability should not disqualify S from counting as omnipotent. Hence, Flint and Freddoso's account acknowledges the logically inescapable limitations which counterfactuals of freedom would place on an omnipotent agent by requiring that the relevant worlds share not only the same history, but also the same world type for S. Unfortunately, Lefkow thinks that the Flint-Freddoso account still has problems. He invites us to suppose that Whitehead's panpsychist metaphysics is true. In that case, everything, even quarks, would be conscious and require divine persuasion. Quote, Whitehead's God, in effect, can't do anything directly or on his own, but talked to others. Thus, if Whitehead had the necessary metaphysical truth about the nature of things, his deity could well come out omnipotent on Flint and Fredosso's account. But I repeat that as Christian philosophical theologians, we are not examining the question of divine omnipotence from a metaphysically neutral perspective. We believe that the God of the Bible exists, and that presupposition rules out the metaphysical possibility of Whiteheadian metaphysics. This objection is therefore fanciful. Leftow's more important objection is that the range of an omnipotent being's power ought to be defined solely in terms of what he can strongly actualize. Leftow does not deny that an omnipotent being has the power to weakly actualize states of affairs, but contends that what states of affairs he can actualize weakly are irrelevant to the range of his power. In support of this surprising contention, Leftow argues first that omnipotence requires the greatest possible range of power to actualize states of affairs strongly at T. This point, even if conceded, does nothing of itself to support Leftow's main contention that weak actualization is irrelevant to the range of an omnipotent being's power. But should we grant the point? Leftow's argument in support of this contention is rather difficult to interpret. But the point seems to be that Flint and Fredosso's account fails to specify the range of states of affairs that S can strongly actualize and the range of states that he can weakly actualize. It speaks only of the total range of S's ability to actualize without differentiation between strong and weak actualization. Leftow thinks that this account allows that the ratio between states that an omnipotent being might be able to actualize strongly or weakly can vary. So long as the total range is maximal, S counts as omnipotent. Leftow complains that a being which can strongly actualize certain states of affairs is more powerful than a being which can actualize those same states of affairs only weakly by persuading other free agents to do them, or perhaps by manipulating them into doing them by the use of counterfactuals of freedom. Since both would count as omnipotent on the Flint-Fredoso account, there could be a being more powerful than an omnipotent being, which is absurd. This complaint is far from compelling. The Flint-Fredoso account simply doesn't address the ratio question, but it does not exclude that there is a maximally powerful ratio unknown and perhaps even undeterminable by us. Leftow himself acknowledges in response to Oppie that strongly actualizes is an artificial technical term without an established sense to violate, and without this it's not clear what intuitions we really have on the subject, end quote. Moreover, weak actualization can be even more impressive than strong actualization. A Molinist God endowed with middle knowledge, and hence the ability to actualize states of affairs by exploiting true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, is breathtakingly powerful compared to a God who brings about states of affairs by raw causal power. The intention of Flint and Fredosso's Molinist-inspired account is clearly that weak actualization applies exclusively to states of affairs that cannot be strongly actualized, such as libertarian free decisions. We can ensure that God has the widest possible range of strong actualization by adding a condition like Wielenberg's, that there is no state which God cannot strongly actualize, due at least partially to a lack of power. Leftow proceeds then to his main contention. Omnipotence should be explicated in terms of strong actualization alone. First, since persuade is a success term, the ability to persuade someone is not intrinsic, but depends on what is the case outside the agent. But omnipotence is an intrinsic attribute. An omnipotent being should not need the help of extrinsic circumstances to give it its power to achieve its effects. If those extrinsic circumstances are contingent, then in addition to broadly logical limits, the absence of those circumstances would be another impeding factor to which an omnipotent being would be subject. The moral, Leftow concludes, is that no being is omnipotent if powers of this sort are relevant to whether one is omnipotent. Indeed, Leftow goes so far as to assert, quote, if there are true counterfactuals and an omnipotent being does not wholly control their truth value, these are contingent and can impede its will too. I suggest that the right conclusion here is that a Molinist God cannot be omnipotent. Now notice that Leftow's anti-Molinist conclusion does not follow, if he is correct, that strong actualization alone counts toward omnipotence. For Leftow agrees that it is logically impossible for God to strongly actualize the free decisions of libertarian creatures. So if one agrees with Leftow that extrinsic circumstances are irrelevant to omnipotence, then one can consistently affirm that there are contingently true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom that impede God's will, and that God is intrinsically omnipotent. At most, it would follow that the Molinist should adopt Leftow's account of omnipotence in terms of strong actualization alone. But should we agree with that restriction? Clearly not, I think. As Flint and Freddoso are wont to emphasize, the true world type for God imposes no non-logical limits on his power. The truth of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom cannot be controlled by God because it is logically impossible for him to strongly actualize the free choices of the libertarian agents described in their consequence. When Leftow complains that the ability to persuade should not be relevant to omnipotence, he seems to have forgotten the distinction between the degree and the range of one's power. We may agree that inability to persuade a libertarian agent is not a limit on the degree of an omnipotent being's power. But since such an inability is not due to any lack of power on his part. But the inability to persuade a libertarian agent is definitely a limit on the range of an omnipotent being's power, and a purely logical limit at that. So the truth of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom constitutes no impediment to S's omnipotence, in addition to the acceptable, broadly logical limits. Second, Leftow points out that the power to persuade is not guaranteed to produce the desired effect. If someone I am trying to persuade has libertarian freedom, then it is beyond my control whether I succeed. Power to persuade is again not an intrinsic power. But if God is omnipotent, he does not depend for his omnipotence on the lucky break of having easily persuadable people around him. Certainly, God has intrinsic powers that can be employed in the effort to persuade, But the ability to persuade is not part of what makes him omnipotent. This second argument makes no advance over the first. The degree of God's power does not depend on having easily persuadable people about, but the range of God's power does. This fact is no infringement upon his omnipotence because it is broadly, logically impossible to guarantee that a libertarian agent in freedom-permitting circumstances will be persuaded. Power to weakly actualize, therefore, depends upon certain extrinsic circumstances, such as the contingent truth of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. But it does not follow, as Leftow believes, that omnipotence is power simply to strongly actualize. Quite the contrary, in fact. Suppose the two allegedly omnipotent beings have exactly the same range of power to strongly actualize states of affairs, but one has, in addition, by virtue of his middle knowledge, an infinitely greater range of power over states of affairs involving the libertarian free choices of others via weak actualization. We have but to ask whether God would be more powerful in a world in which he can only strongly actualize states of affairs, or in a world in which he has that same power plus the power intentionally to weakly actualize states of affairs. A Molinist God is incomprehensibly more powerful than a God who lacks middle knowledge. Therefore, power to weakly actualize is definitely relevant to a range account of omnipotence. And so that actually brings us then to the concluding remarks, 8.3. So putting together the two parts of the analysis, we have as our account of omnipotence, an account that involves both the degree of power and the range of power of S. S is omnipotent at T if and only if, 1, it is not the case at T that there is some state of affairs S that S is unable to bring about, at least partially because of a lack of power in S, and 2, S has the power at T to actualize S if there is some world having both the same history at T and the same world type for S as the actual world in which someone actualizes S at T. Since omnipotence so defined is a coherent property, which is clearly great making, perfect being theology warrants characterizing the Almighty God of the Bible as omnipotent.